Imagine living in a neighborhood where joy itself was illegal, where one woman believed she could control not just your home, but even your holidays. This was the year Willow Creek's HOA tried to ban Santa Claus. But what started as one man in a red suit quickly spiraled into the most outrageous battle this community had ever seen. And by Christmas Eve, the HOA would discover what happens when an entire neighborhood fights back against the Grinch who thought she could cancel Christmas. The neighborhood of Willow Creek had always been a picture-perfect example of suburban order. Each house was carefully painted in neutral shades approved by the HOA. Lawns were trimmed with military precision, and even holiday decorations were limited by a long list of strict rules buried in the association's handbook. To outsiders, it appeared to be a flawless community. But to those who lived there, the heavy hand of the HOA was felt in nearly every decision they made. That December, something unusual happened. At the corner of Chestnut Lane, a family known for their cheerful spirit decided to do something extra special for the neighborhood children. They hired a local Santa Claus performer, a retired firefighter named George, who had been donning the red suit for years. His presence was meant to bring joy, laughter, and holiday magic to the children of Willow Creek. Every evening, George sat in a beautifully decorated front yard, greeting kids, listening to their wishes, and posing for pictures. For the children, it was unforgettable. Families from nearby streets brought their kids, smiling as they watched George play his role with warmth and authenticity. Candy canes were handed out, carols played softly in the background, and neighbors who rarely spoke to one another suddenly gathered together. The corner of Chestnut Lane became a small holiday hub, buzzing with happiness and unity. But joy, as it often does in tightly controlled neighborhoods, did not sit well with everyone. The HOA board, led by a president infamous for her strict enforcement of rules, took notice. From the very first evening Santa appeared, complaints began trickling in. The president called it an unauthorized gathering, while another board member muttered about parking congestion. But what bothered them most wasn't traffic or noise. It was that someone had dared to create joy outside their control, behind closed doors. The HOA board began labeling Santa's presence as an unauthorized business. They argued that George, though hired for fun and not profit, represented a violation of neighborhood bylaws. Their reasoning was thin, but the board thrived on technicalities. A letter was drafted within days, stamped with official HOA letterhead, and delivered to the family hosting Santa. It demanded that the gatherings cease immediately. The letter arrived just as the excitement around Santa was growing. Parents were sharing photos online, neighbors were spreading word-of-mouth invitations, and kids were buzzing with anticipation every evening after school. When the family opened the letter, shock spread across their faces. The HOA had ordered Santa to pack up and leave. The news hit the neighborhood like a bitterly cold wind. Whispers of disbelief spread quickly, followed by frustration. Parents were outraged, children were confused, and even residents who normally stayed quiet about HOA disputes began shaking their heads. How could anyone see Santa Claus as a problem? Yet the board was relentless. They scheduled an emergency meeting, announcing to the community that the unauthorized Santa posed legal risks and violated regulations. They framed it as an issue of control, order, and compliance, disguising their dislike of the festivities with technical jargon. It wasn't about rules, it was about power. But power has a way of provoking resistance. For the first time in years, the homeowners of Willow Creek began murmuring not just about their frustration, but about standing together. Conversations sparked on porches, in driveways, and in the glow of Christmas lights. Some neighbors suggested petitions, others whispered about going to the media, and a few spoke boldly of direct defiance. Santa, unaware of the brewing storm, continued to spread cheer in the evenings. George laughed, posed, and gave his all to the children who flocked to him, their eyes shining. Parents smiled, but behind those smiles was a new determination. They knew the HOA had overstepped, and they weren't about to let their children's holiday be stolen by a board obsessed with control. The tension rose like frost gathering on a window pane. The HOA was sharpening its rules, The families were sharpening their resolve, and the stage was being set for a battle unlike anything Willow Creek had seen before. And as the twinkling lights of the neighborhood glowed brighter, so too did the quiet anger of the people who had finally decided enough was enough. The war for Christmas had begun. The emergency HOA meeting was unlike any the neighborhood had seen before. Usually such meetings were sparsely attended, with only a handful of homeowners showing up to hear about lawn violations or dues increases. But this time the room was filled wall to wall. Families came with folded arms and determined faces. Their children left at home while adults prepared for a fight. At the center of it all sat the HOA president, a woman known for her rigid interpretation of rules and her unshakable belief in her own authority. To her left and right sat the board members, stern, silent, and complicit. On the long oak table before them was a neatly stacked pile of complaints and a copy of the neighborhood bylaws, its pages already marked with yellow tabs to highlight selective rules. The president began the meeting with an air of superiority. She described the Santa gatherings as unauthorized events, claiming they disrupted traffic, created noise, and endangered neighborhood security. Her voice was cold, each word carefully chosen to strip the event of its joy and reduce it to a supposed threat. She leaned heavily on the argument that Santa's presence constituted a business operating within the neighborhood without HOA approval. But the residents were not silent. For the first time, voices rose in unison, not shouting, but speaking with frustration and disbelief. They described the happiness the gatherings had brought, the way it had united families, and how it had given their children a holiday memory they would never forget. Parents spoke of the community spirit that had emerged in a neighborhood once defined by isolation and strict rules. The board refused to listen. They doubled down, declaring that if the gatherings continued, the family hosting Santa would face daily fines. They warned that legal action could follow. And with each threat, the air in the room grew heavier, charged with the weight of anger and defiance. Word of the crackdown spread quickly after the meeting. Some neighbors were furious, others discouraged, and a few were fearful of the board's threats. But at the heart of Willow Creek, a sense of rebellion was growing stronger. For years, residents had tolerated the HOA's overreach, whether it was fines for mailbox colors, warnings for driveway chalk drawings, or threats over garden gnomes. But banning Santa Claus during Christmas was the final straw. The next evening, Santa returned to Chestnut Lane, but this time the atmosphere was different. The children still ran forward with excitement, but the parents stood behind them with quiet determination. As George laughed and ho-ho-hoed, families whispered among themselves, strategizing in the glow of twinkling lights. They knew the HOA would come down harder, and they were ready to resist. True to form, the HOA wasted no time. Official notices were delivered to the family's doorstep, threatening steep fines if Santa appeared again. The letters were intimidating, stamped with legal jargon and written to frighten homeowners into submission. But instead of backing down, the family pinned the letter to their refrigerator like a badge of honor. They were not alone, and they were aware of it. Meanwhile, smaller acts of resistance began to spread across the neighborhood. One by one, houses started putting up oversized holiday decorations. Inflatable Santas, glowing reindeer, and animated snowmen began appearing in yards. Some residents, who had previously never decorated at all, joined in the movement. Chestnut Lane transformed into a beacon of holiday cheer, an unspoken message to the HOA that the community would not be bullied into silence. The board responded with fury. More letters were sent, more threats were made. But the more they pushed, the more united the neighborhood became. What started as a single Santa Claus in one family's yard had grown into something larger, a collective act of defiance. Behind the scenes, neighbors were planning something even bigger. Parents began drafting petitions, collecting signatures that challenged the board's authority. Others researched legal protections for holiday displays and community events. A few tech-savvy residents started filming the gatherings, capturing the joy of children and the pettiness of the HOA, knowing that the footage could easily go viral if shared. But the real turning point came when the HOA president, desperate to reassert control, made a critical mistake. One evening, she personally showed up at Chestnut Lane while Santa was greeting children. She marched across the lawn, snapping photos and jotting notes, her face twisted with anger. Parents stepped forward, shielding their children, their voices steady but filled with restrained fury. The sight of a neighborhood leader confronting families during what was supposed to be a moment of joy sent shockwaves through the community. The incident spread quickly. Videos of her storming through the crowd surfaced online, shared among residents and beyond. What the HOA had framed as a matter of rules and regulations now appeared to outsiders as an attack on holiday tradition itself. And with that, the battle shifted. It was no longer just about fines or technical violations. It was about something bigger, something symbolic. The board had declared war on Santa Claus, and in doing so, they had awakened a resistance they could no longer control. The families of Willow Creek were ready. The next phase of their fight would not just be about standing their ground, it would be about turning the tables. The HOA thought they could silence the laughter and joy of Christmas. What they didn't realize was that they had given the community something far more powerful, a reason to rise together. The morning after the HOA president's public outburst, Willow Creek was buzzing with quiet conversations. What had once been an isolated conflict between one family and the HOA had now grown into a shared battle for dignity, joy, and freedom. The residents had witnessed the board's cruelty firsthand, and the president's actions had crossed a line that could never be erased. It was no longer just about Santa Claus. It was about control. It was about years of frustration bottled up inside every homeowner who had been fined for trivialities and threatened for harmless decisions. And now, that anger had found a single unifying spark: the eviction of Christmas. The retaliation began small. It was deliberate. Families who had never put up decorations suddenly filled their yards with lights, inflatables, and ornaments. Streets that were once dark and uniform glowed with color and cheer. Inflatables of Santa Claus sprouted like mushrooms after rain, some towering, some small, but all proudly on display. The message was simple. If the HOA wanted to fight Santa, they would have to fight hundreds of him. The board responded predictably, sending out another wave of warning letters. But the sheer number of violations overwhelmed them. Where once they had picked off isolated homeowners with ease, they now faced near total resistance. Every street corner was alive with music and laughter. The authority they had wielded so confidently was crumbling under the weight of unity. Meanwhile, the parents of Willow Creek were crafting something bigger than decorations. They organized meetings in living rooms and garages, whispering plans over cups of cocoa and stacks of cookies. They weren't just resisting. They were plotting an event so massive that the HOA could never contain it. They called it the Christmas spectacle, and it would be unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. The plan was simple in design. It was devastating in execution. On one chosen night, the entire community would gather on Chestnut Lane, surrounding Santa in a show of solidarity. Every house would contribute, some with lights, others with food, and many with sheer presence. It would not be a hidden act of defiance, but a public celebration too large for the HOA to suppress. The children were brought into the secret carefully, their excitement fueling the momentum. They drew posters, baked cookies with their parents, and whispered eagerly about the big surprise. For them, it was about protecting Santa, the man who listened to their dreams and made Christmas magical. For the adults, it was about reclaiming their freedom from an oppressive board that had ruled for too long. In the days leading up to the spectacle, the HOA ramped up its efforts. They hired security patrols to monitor the neighborhood, sent legal threats to multiple families, and even called the city to report supposed safety violations. But each attempt fell flat. The city inspectors who came saw nothing dangerous about Christmas lights and inflatable snowmen. The HOA's desperation was becoming obvious. What they didn't realize was that the residents were documenting everything. Videos of board members lurking around houses, taking photos of decorations, and harassing families were quietly shared online. A private group chat grew larger by the day, filled with screenshots, evidence, and plans. The narrative was shifting against the board, and all it would take was one spark to make it explode. That spark came sooner than anyone expected. A local reporter, tipped off by a neighbor's cousin, reached out about the Santa eviction story. Intrigued by the absurdity, the reporter visited the neighborhood, interviewing parents and capturing footage of the decorations. The piece aired on a regional news station, framing the HOA as the villains trying to ban Christmas. Within hours, the clip spread online, shared and ridiculed across social media. The HOA board had become infamous, their actions mocked by thousands of strangers who saw them as joyless tyrants. While the board scrambled to issue a defensive statement, the community doubled down on its preparations. The spectacle was no longer just for Willow Creek. It was for everyone watching. On the night of the event, the air was crisp and the streets alive with anticipation. Families emerged from their homes carrying trays of cookies, thermoses of hot chocolate, and battery-powered candles. Children wore Santa hats and reindeer antlers, their eyes wide with excitement. Music filled the air, not from a single speaker but from dozens of homes playing carols in unison. At the center of it all sat George, the man in the red suit, his chair framed by lights and a backdrop of shimmering decorations. As the crowd gathered around him, the true scale of the rebellion became clear. Nearly the entire neighborhood had joined, their presence a living declaration that joy could not be outlawed. Drones flew overhead, capturing the glowing streets and the massive crowd. Parents posted videos in real time, tagging news outlets and community groups. Within minutes, the hashtag Save Santa began trending. The HOA had tried to silence a single man in a costume, and instead, they had created a viral movement. When the board members appeared at the edge of the crowd, clutching clipboards and glaring with disapproval, they found themselves ignored. Their warnings fell on deaf ears as the community sang carols louder, their voices rising into the night sky. For the first time, the board's power seemed small, irrelevant, and almost laughable. That night, Willow Creek became more than a neighborhood. It became a symbol, a place where ordinary families stood together against pettiness and control, reclaiming the simple right to celebrate. And though the HOA would not give up easily, the people had made their statement loud and clear. The fight was far from over, but the balance had shifted. The board could no longer hide behind rules and letters. They had declared war on Santa Claus, and now the world was watching. The morning after the Christmas spectacle, Willow Creek was buzzing with pride. Videos of the event had spread across social media, and even neighbors from nearby towns had driven through the streets just to see the decorations for themselves. Parents smiled as they watched their children replay footage of themselves sitting on Santa's lap, while the hashtag #DocSaveSanta continued to gather momentum online. But not everyone was celebrating. Behind the closed doors of the HOA's headquarters, a converted spare bedroom in the president's house, the board gathered in a tense, furious meeting. Their authority had been challenged in the most public way possible, and worse, they had become the laughingstock of the internet. Clips of the president scowling in the crowd were being shared with mocking captions, her face frozen in anger as children cheered around Santa. The president, red with fury, declared the neighborhood to be in a state of emergency. She accused the families of violating rules, endangering safety and tarnishing the reputation of Willow Creek. Her fellow board members, embarrassed but unwilling to defy her, nodded along as she proposed drastic action. That very day, the first wave of retaliation hit. Dozens of violation notices were mailed out, targeting anyone whose decorations were deemed excessive. Inflatable Santas were labeled unapproved. Structures, strings of lights were suddenly classified as electrical. Hazards, even wreaths on doors were listed as violations of uniformity standards. For some families, the fines amounted to hundreds of dollars overnight. The board wasn't finished. They hired a private security company to patrol the streets, intimidating residents with flashlights and notepads, recording license plates of visitors. They issued threats that cars parked near Chestnut Lane would be towed and that repeat offenders might even face legal liens against their homes. It was an all-out campaign of fear designed to break the unity that had formed. For a moment, doubt crept into the community. Some families, already stretched thin by holiday expenses, worried about the mounting fines. A few neighbors quietly took down their decorations, unable to bear the financial risk. The board celebrated these small victories, mistaking fear for surrender. But they underestimated the resolve of Willow Creek. While the HOA grew louder with threats, the families grew smarter with resistance. Tech-savvy residents organized a digital campaign, sharing images of the fines and security patrols online. They framed the HOA as a heartless machine waging war on Christmas, and the narrative struck a chord with strangers everywhere. Comments poured in from people across the country, condemning the board and praising the families for standing up. At the same time, the residents of Willow Creek began pooling resources. Lawyers in the neighborhood volunteered their expertise, reviewing the bylaws and pointing out weaknesses. Others offered to cover fines for families under pressure, creating a quiet fund of support. Far from being divided, the neighborhood was evolving into something stronger, fueled not only by defiance but by solidarity. Still, the HOA pressed forward. In a dramatic move, the president issued a cease and desist letter to George, the man who played Santa, accusing him of trespassing and unauthorized business activity. The letter threatened legal action if he set foot in the neighborhood again. It was a bold gamble, aimed at cutting off the very heart of the rebellion, but George was not easily frightened. He had once run into burning buildings to save lives. He was not about to back down because of paperwork. When residents learned of the letter, their anger boiled over. The HOA had crossed a line yet again, targeting not just a tradition, but a man who had given joy to their children. The backlash was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, this time framing it as the HOA trying to evict Santa Claus. The headline alone was enough to spark outrage, and soon the board was drowning in negative attention. Phone calls flooded their office, emails poured in, and even strangers drove through Willow Creek just to honk and cheer in support. The president, cornered but still defiant, doubled down. She contacted city officials demanding they intervene. She claimed the gatherings were unsafe, citing traffic and fire hazards. Inspectors were dispatched once again, but when they arrived, they found nothing wrong. If anything, they were greeted with cookies and cocoa, treated more like guests than enforcers. The officials left with smiles, further undermining the HOA's credibility. As Christmas drew closer, the conflict reached a fever pitch. Each night, Santa returned, and each night the crowds grew larger. The HOA's patrols were drowned out by carolers, their clipboards rendered useless by the sheer number of families present. The board threatened, fined, and scowled, but their power was slipping through their fingers like snow melting in the sun. The residents of Willow Creek had stopped being passive homeowners. They had become a movement. Their holiday spirit was no longer just about decorations or Santa Claus. It was about defying control, about reclaiming joy in the face of oppression. And yet, deep inside, everyone knew the battle was far from over. The board was not finished, and the president's fury had not cooled. If anything, her desperation was growing. She had failed to silence them with fines and fear, and that made her dangerous. What she did next would push the neighborhood to the brink. The HOA president could feel control slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. For years, she had ruled Willow Creek with an iron grip, dictating everything from mailbox colors to lawn heights, silencing dissent with fines and intimidation. But now, in a matter of weeks, her authority had unraveled in front of the entire community, and worse, in front of the world watching online. She told herself she would not be humiliated. She told herself she would not lose. Locked away in her home office, blinds drawn against the festive glow outside, she drafted her most aggressive plan yet. The fines had failed. The security patrols had been mocked. The cease and desist had only fueled more resistance. If she wanted to crush the rebellion once and for all, she would need to escalate beyond anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Her solution was drastic. She contacted the HOA's legal team, instructing them to begin proceedings for injunctions against the family hosting Santa, as well as against George himself. It was a move designed not just to stop the gatherings, but to financially ruin those at the heart of the movement. With court filings, legal fees, and threats of liens against homes, she believed she could finally scare the community into submission. But that wasn't all. She also ordered that tow trucks be on standby to remove any cars parked on Chestnut Lane during Santa nights, calling them illegal obstructions. She wrote letters to local businesses, warning them not to donate supplies or decorations, claiming the gatherings were unlawful. And in a final act of vindictiveness, she filed a complaint with the city fire marshal, insisting that the lights and decorations posed a fire hazard that endangered lives. It was a declaration of war. When the first wave of legal notices arrived in mailboxes, the neighborhood buzzed with unease. The threats were no longer empty. Court summons and official documents carried a weight that even the most defiant families couldn't ignore. Fear rippled through Willow Creek, and for a brief moment, the spirit of unity flickered. But then came the fire marshal's inspection. Neighbors braced themselves, worried that this time the HOA might finally win. Yet when the inspector arrived, he was met with something unexpected. Dozens of families stood outside their homes, offering warm drinks, cookies, and genuine kindness. The inspector walked the streets, examining lights and inflatables, checking cords and outlets. And after a thorough review, he smiled. Everything was up to code. Nothing was unsafe. The report he filed officially cleared the community of any violations. The HOA president's strategy had backfired. Instead of proving her case, she had exposed her vendetta. The fire marshal's visit galvanized the residents. The fear that had begun to creep in was replaced with renewed determination. Parents whispered plans late into the night. Teens created viral videos mocking the HOA's attempts to ban Christmas. Even children added their voices, holding handmade signs that read, "Let Santa stay." The neighborhood was no longer just reacting, it was organizing. The final straw came with the tow trucks. On a cold December evening, as families gathered around Santa once more, the rumble of diesel engines echoed down Chestnut Lane. 2 trucks rolled in, lights flashing, hooks rattling. The security patrol directed them toward cars parked along the street, pointing them out like prey to be hunted. But before a single car could be touched, the crowd closed ranks. Dozens of residents stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a barrier between the trucks and the parked vehicles. Parents, teenagers, and even elderly neighbors linked arms in defiance. They didn't shout. They didn't move. They simply stood there, unyielding, their breath visible in the cold night air. The tow truck drivers hesitated. They had been told to remove cars, but this was no ordinary job. This was a standoff, and the sight of an entire neighborhood united against them was more powerful than any HOA order. After a tense pause, the drivers backed away, their trucks retreating slowly into the night. The victory was small, but it was decisive. The HOA's most aggressive move had been stopped not by lawyers or officials, but by ordinary families standing together. And that night, as Santa hugged children and neighbors exchanged smiles, the community realized something important. The president could no longer control them. Still, they knew the battle wasn't finished. Legal threats still loomed, fines still hung over their heads, and the HOA president was more determined than ever. She had one final card to play, and everyone could feel it coming, so the residents prepared their endgame. They gathered evidence, compiled videos, and contacted reporters who had already covered the story. They dug into the HOA's finances, searching for irregularities. And they planned one last spectacle, an event so large, so undeniable, that it would expose the board's corruption and strip the president of her power once and for all. The fight had begun as a single Santa in one yard. Now it was a full-blown rebellion. And as Christmas Day approached, the stage was set for the final showdown between the HOA president's obsession with control and the community's unshakable spirit of joy. Christmas Eve arrived in Willow Creek, but the air felt heavier than the twinkling lights suggested. The neighborhood had endured weeks of battles, threats, and standoffs. Fines still piled up in mailboxes, lawsuits loomed in court. And the HOA president had made it clear she wouldn't stop until she had crushed the spirit of the entire community. But the residents had decided that this night would not be about fear. It would be about defiance, unity, and joy. And so, in secret, They had been planning something far larger than any of the board could imagine. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the quiet streets began to transform. Families emerged from their homes carrying boxes of lights, armfuls of decorations, trays of food, and bundles of blankets. Children dragged sleds filled with ornaments and candy canes. Teenagers set up speakers at corners while parents arranged tables overflowing with hot cocoa and gingerbread. By the time darkness settled, Chestnut Lane was unrecognizable. Every home glowed in dazzling color. Trees shimmered with ornaments. Inflatables rose like giants across lawns, and at the very center of it all stood Santa. George, dressed in his bright red suit, surrounded by laughter and cheer. The neighborhood had built not just a display, but a festival. And this time they had invited everyone. Cars began arriving from outside Willow Creek. Strangers who had followed the viral story online came to witness it for themselves. Reporters set up cameras, capturing the scene as it unfolded. Local news anchors spoke in astonishment about the neighborhood that refused to let Christmas be taken from them. But the true climax came when the HOA president herself appeared. She marched down the street, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 board members and the HOA's hired security. Her expression was twisted with rage, her voice sharp as she ordered people to disperse. She threatened arrests. She threatened fines. She shouted about violations and injunctions, her words shrill against the joyous music playing in the background. And then something remarkable happened. No one listened. Parents continued sipping cocoa. Children danced to Christmas songs. Santa posed for pictures. Families laughed, sang, and hugged as though she wasn't even there. The president's commands, once feared, now carried no weight. She had lost her power, and she could feel it slipping away with every ignored word. The reporters' cameras caught it all. The angry, isolated figure screaming into the void while her community celebrated without her. The footage spread like wildfire online, shared across platforms with captions like the HOA that tried to cancel Christmas and Santa versus the Grinch president. But the real blow came not from the laughter or the cameras, but from the documents. Neighbors had spent weeks collecting evidence, misuse of HOA funds, favoritism in enforcement, and inflated fines that had no legal backing. On Christmas Eve, as the president stood seething, one homeowner handed a thick folder to a local reporter. Within hours, the contents were public, proof of corruption that went far beyond Christmas lights. The backlash was immediate. Homeowners called for an emergency meeting. Petitions spread through the neighborhood demanding the president's resignation. By Christmas morning, the board could no longer shield her. Under pressure from the very people she had sought to control, the HOA president was forced to step down. Her reign ended not with a gavel or a court order, but with the laughter of children, the glow of lights, and the spirit of a community she could not break. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek transformed. The new board dissolved many of the petty rules that had strangled joy for so long. Fines were forgiven. The lawsuits were dropped. The HOA shifted its focus from punishment to support, funding community events instead of hunting for violations. And Santa? He became more than just a holiday tradition. Every year, George returned in his red suit, but now he wasn't alone. The entire neighborhood dressed as elves, reindeer, and snowmen. Together, they turned Willow Creek into a Christmas wonderland that drew visitors from across the state. What had started as one man in a Santa suit had grown into a movement, a reminder that communities were strongest when they stood together. As the years passed, the story of Willow Creek spread far beyond its streets. It became a cautionary tale about unchecked power, but also a celebration of unity. And every December, when the lights flickered on and Santa arrived once more, neighbors remembered the year they had fought for joy and won, because in the end, it wasn't just about decorations or rules or even Santa himself. It was about people refusing to let fear and control steal their happiness. It was about standing together against unfairness, and it was about proving once and for all that not even the most stubborn HOA could evict Christmas.